Germany on January 30th, 1933. Appointed Chancellor of Germany, Adolf Hitler creates the first concentration camp, Dachau, close to Munich and rapidly starts to restrict the civil and human rights of the Jews and other people judged to be enemies of the state. Apart from political prisoners and Jews, the government targets Afro-Germans, who suffer discrimination and persecution despite their quite limited presence in Germany. Unknown numbers of black people living in Germany and German-occupied territory will be sterilized, imprisoned, or killed even though the Nazis lack a deliberate campaign to eradicate them. One such individual is Gert Schramm, who was born in Erfurt, the capital and biggest city of Thuringia, then under the Weimar Republic, the government of Germany from 1918 to 1933 on November 28, 1928. Arriving in Thuringia on a contract to build a bridge, his parents were Jack Branson, a black American engineer with a steel company from San Francisco, and Marianne Schramm, a white German woman. The two crossed paths in the store of gentleman's tailor Gert Schramm, Marianne's father. Black people's daily life in Weimar Germany included racism, which made it challenging for them to find work, a situation aggravated by the Great Depression beginning in 1929, 1 year after Gert Schramm was born. Following the end of his employment, Jack Branson left Germany but returned often to Thuringia, where his son Gert was growing up. Once in power in Germany in 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party started to implement their incorrect and discriminating racial theories into legislation. Considered as members of the supposedly superior Aryan race, the Nazis aimed to establish a racially pure Germany. They aimed at black, Roma, and Jewish people including Gert Schramm as non-Aryans, and as members of ostensibly inferior races. Laws the Nazis approved restricted the rights of non-Aryan Germans. Originally meant to exclude Jews, these rules also covered black and Romani peoples. Black Germans experienced growing persecution, marginalizing, and isolation during the Nazi era. Although they had experienced racism throughout the Weimar era, the institutionalized racism of the Nazi government made life especially more challenging and unstable for them and their families. Black people in Germany so witnessed the Nazi ascendancy as a turning point in their life. Nazi racial philosophy penetrated German daily life in all spheres. Many Germans adopted this philosophy and freely persecuted black people on their own will. For many thousands black people then residing in Germany, it became even more difficult to locate and retain employment. Bosses and colleagues were unwilling to collaborate with those whose skin tone identified them as foreigners inside the Nazi racial society. Common were poverty, evictions, and firings. Some black people recall life in Nazi Germany as one in which strangers spat on them and freely called them racial epithets. People of non-Aryan descent were kicked from the German civil service by the law for the restoration of the professional civil service in April 1933. Though the purpose to exclude Jews was clear, other decrees underlined that this also applied to black and Romani people. The edict was imprecise as to exactly define non-Aryan descent. Actually, since only citizens could be public officials, very few black people were directly impacted by this statute. And most of the black German citizens were still too young to be working in the civil service. Born in the Rhineland, a part of Western Germany, these multiracial people were citizens. Their dads were largely French colonial soldiers who had been part of the vast Allied military occupation of the Rhineland between 1918 and 1930. Their mothers were white German ladies. Between 600 to 800 multiracial children born in the Rhineland were referred to by the German press under the negative name Rhineland bastards during the Weimar era. Due in great part to their dads and looks, these children were frequently subjected to discrimination. From their neighbors, classmates, and inside their own homes, they encountered bigotry. Some stayed with their birth moms or relatives, while others were adopted or placed into children's homes. For these children, the previously mentioned edict and later race-based prohibitions drastically reduced future employment possibilities and career routes. It also made abundantly evident that the Nazis intended to officially exclude black people from Germany's society and did not regard them as part of the national community of Germany. The Nazi government declared the Nuremberg race laws in September 1935, therefore codifying Nazi racial beliefs into legal form. Originally aimed mostly at Jews, the Nuremberg laws also applied to Romani and black people, whom the government disparagingly referred to as gypsies, Negroes, and their bastards, beginning in November 1935. Two Nuremberg race laws applied here. The first, the Reich Citizenship Law, defined a German citizen as someone of German or related blood. The goal was to deny political rights in Germany to those the government considered as racial inferior, black people, Roma, and Jews, among others. The second was the law safeguarding German honor and blood. This statute outlawed race defilement, or race mixing. It outlawed future intermarriages between Jews and people of German or related blood. Later on, the legislation prevented black people living in Germany from wed people of German or related blood. The intention was to stop black people from wedging Germans into their marriages and starting families. Black individuals in Germany had great difficulty starting families, getting married, or planning a future under the Nuremberg race laws. Those of reproductive and marrying age were especially impacted. Black individuals were legally free to marry each other, but given the small black population, those pairings were rare. Some black people and so-called German Aryans continued to be romantically engaged despite the Nuremberg laws. For both individuals, these partnerships were risky, particularly if they decided to attempt a legal marriage. Everyone in Nazi Germany had to apply for permission to wed. Interracial couples petitions were routinely denied for racial grounds. Government officials were aware of these uses, bringing interracial partnerships under their notice. For the pair, this usually had disastrous results. Many times, marriage applications led to harassment, sterilization, and broken relationships. Legal couples whose marriages preceded the Nuremberg laws were under persecution by the Naziregime. The government pushed white German women to divorce their black spouses. When interracial couples and their children showed up in public, they were often harassed and even attacked. Many black children in Germany went through the Nazi era as a period of heightened loneliness, isolation, and exclusion, same as their parents. Some black children wanted to be part of the excitement and felt German. But black German children fit no Nazi racial philosophy. Schools turned into humiliating venues for black youngsters living in Nazi Germany. Teachers who backed the Nazis would often denigrate black pupils in racial science lectures. Black children suffered over the 1930s, just as the Nazification of the educational system drastically limited the rights of Jewish children to attend public schools. Some black students were kicked out and unable to finish their course of study. Few private schools would let black pupils in acquiring apprenticeships, which in Germany was vital to find job, became increasingly difficult. Such was the situation for Gert Schramm, who worked as a helper in a car repair shop following elementary school. The Nuremberg laws said he was denied the right to any apprenticeship as a Mischling of the first grade. In Nazi Germany, the disparaging legal term Mischling referred to those with mixed Aryan and non-Aryan background as defined in the Nuremberg racial laws of 1935. Living under the Nazi regime, most black people were essentially imprisoned there. While some tried to leave, for the great majority this was not feasible since citizenship problems prevented them from legitimately immigrating elsewhere or obtaining visas to other nations. Black people living in Germany eventually had little option but to adjust to life under the Nazis. Beginning on September 1, 1939 with the invasion of Poland, the Second World War got underway. Nazi policies aimed against black people became more severe during World War II. This happened in line with the general radicalization of Nazi policy against alleged political and racial rivals. Many black people found themselves imprisoned in workhouses, jails, hospitals, psychiatric facilities, and concentration camps as laws and policies exacerbated racism and prejudice in Germany. Jack Brankson, Gert's father, was transported to the Auschwitz death camp after being caught on one of his trips to Germany on grounds of Nazi racial policies in 1941. He vanished from sight after that. Gert Schramm was not an exception, though, either. In May 1944 he was arrested. Officially, the Gestapo under law for the protection of German blood and honor placed him under protective custody, since his father was an Afro-American man. He was denied food and water, beaten, hit in the face and knocked about for weeks until on July 20, 1944, when he was finally deported to Buchenwald concentration camp, one of the biggest camps built inside German boundaries. 15 years old, he closed behind him the gate bearing the inscription, Jedem das Sein, meaning, to each what he deserves. Gert stopped receiving calls by his name at that point. He turned into only a number, 49489, tattooed on his left arm. His sentencing was for an unidentified period, minimum 15 years. Living in the Buchenwald main camp encircled by an electric barbed wire fence, watchtowers, and a chain of sentries mounted with automatic machine guns, prisoners. Renowned punishment block known as the bunker, where offenders of camp rules were punished and frequently tortured to death, stood at the main camp gate. Apart from the punishment block, the main camp consisted in 33 wooden barracks, buildings for disinfection, a brothel, and a cremation. Political prisoners, those arrested for some sort of political opposition to the Nazi government, comprised most of the early detainees at Buchenwald. Apart from the political prisoners and Jews, Buchenwald inmates comprised serial offenders, Jehovah's Witnesses, Sinti and Roma people, German military deserters. Gert had to perform hard forced labor in Buchenwald. He was buried in a satellite commando during an Allied aircraft bombing strike at this period. Later on he remembered, during the attack I had a serious head cut. Nevertheless, the parlor service first refused to transfer me to the infirmary because they feared I might not return. In the SS, an injured prisoner may be rapidly categorized as a useless eater, and then merely hosed down. But the cut got contaminated, and I started fever. My neighbors at last sent me to the outpatient clinic, with sad heart. It was eventually my time hours later, and the terrifying delight of receiving personal treatment from the infirmary chief. He shoved me into the operating room, where a man was getting his leg severed without anesthesia. Then he glanced quickly at my head and, without sudden, simply hooked open the incision. The great agony almost caused me to pass out. With some sort of pliers, he worked to extract a metal splinter caught in his cranium. When that proved insufficient, he helped using a hammer and chisel. Every knock made me believe my head would blow apart. Following that, for 3 difficult weeks my friends looked after me. 15-year-old Gert was then taken to Barrack 42 with the so-called political detainees, where he encountered amiable individuals. Most were communists who had spent a lot of time in Buchenwald and so knew the camp rather well. They advised Gert on how to guard himself from beatings at roll call and which job specifics were somewhat less unpleasant. Lower Saxony communist Otto Gross, the block senior, sat down with Gert and gave him important advice. Just don't draw attention, hide in the middle during roll call, don't look SS soldiers in the face. Those suggestions would subsequently save his life. Gert was also compelled to labor in a limestone quarry in the camp, providing the buildings, road, and walkway materials. Among the toughest jobs, quarry labor was one. Inmates had an extremely poor survival rate. Schramm and political prisoners he was assigned hauled up to 10 dead from the quarry back to the camp daily. Many perished from tiredness or from SS shot on the run. Following 3 weeks in a quarry, a communist capo Willy Bleicher relocated Gert to a simpler employment in a construction team. At last he found himself in the carpentry workshop, where the working circumstances were more pleasant. Roll call numbered them before the Buchenwald inmates left for their jobs. Roll call was extended and frequently lasted long hours if the numbers did not match, which may be exceptionally torturing for the prisoners, especially during bad weather. Schramm subsequently remembered how they were told to stand outside, from 5 to 11 a.m., in the snow on cold winter days without food or drink. Simply because he had moved during roll call, Schramm once witnessed a prisoner, a young Jew from Leipzig named Wolfgang Kohn, being crushed to death by an SS guard. The unhealthy or those who stood out ran the danger of being transported to an extermination camp or executed right away at roll calls. He was in a frail state after weeks in a stone quarry and already stood out as the lone black prisoner. Otto Gross, the block senior mentioned before, arranged other prisoners around him during daily roll call, therefore shielding him. April 1945 found the liberation of the Buchenwald camp. Using a covert shortwave transmitter and modest generator, Buchenwald camp inmates deliver the Morse code message to the Allies on April 8, 1945. To the Army of General Patton. This is the Buchenwald concentration camp. SOS is here. We ask for assistance. US should be evacuated, they want. 3 minutes following the broadcast, the terrified inmates get the word, hold out. The SS wants to wipe us. Rushing to help you. 3rd Army troops. 3 days later, on April 11th, the U.S. 6th Armaments Division freed Buchenwald and discovered more than 20,000 frail and emaciated survivors. They survived since the Gestapo did not know that the administrators had already fled, and a prisoner answered the phone informing headquarters that explosives would not be needed, as the camp had already been blown up, which was not true. When Gestapo headquarters at Weimar telephoned the camp administration to announce that it was sending explosives to blow up any evidence of the camp, including its inmates, the Gestapo did not know that the administrator. General Patton ordered the mayor of the nearby city of Weimar to bring 1,000 residents to Buchenwald to be shown the cremation and other proof of Nazi crimes after his tour of the camp. Rather than discounting Nazi crimes as atrocity propaganda, the Americans sought to make sure the German people would answer for them. Many of them were crying, some of them passed out at seeing the dead bodies, famished survivors behind barbed wire fences, as well as a table display of paintings on human skin, lampshades made of human flesh, various parts of the human body preserved in alcohol, and 2 heads which shrank to 1/5 their usual scale. Gert Schramm was at the Buchenwald when thousands of Weimar residents paid visits. They said, "We had no idea what was happening." Gert, though, never thought they true. Years after the war ended, he said, "Now have a look what happened here with your acquiescence." From all around Europe, the SS imprisoned roughly 250,000 people in Buchenwald between July 1937 and April 1945. Since camp officials never logged a noteworthy number of the detainees, exact death counts for the Buchenwald location are only approximable. Using the Buchenwald camp system, the SS killed at least 56,000 male inmates. There were 11,000 Jews among them. Gert Schramm came home, on foot, into a fresh life in June 1945. He then worked in the Soviet occupation zone's Wismut uranium mine. He worked at a coal mine in Essen from 1956 until 1964, but thereafter decided to relocate to East Germany. Hermann Axen, another former Buchenwald prisoner who had been one of a gang of communist prisoners who kept him safe during his incarceration, helped him launch his own cap firm, Schramm's Reisen, in 1985. Schramm for years visited colleges as a member of the Prisoners' Advisory Board of the Buchenwald Memorial Foundation to discuss the atrocities of the camp. On one such visit in 2012 he declared, "I wish our youth will never give in to these racist Nazi thugs, and they won't heed their views filled with hatred and racial discrimination." Gert Schramm passed away on April 18, 2016, following a protracted illness, aged 87. His friend and European Parliament member Pierrette Herzberger Fofana feels he never totally recovered from his country's rejection of him due of his skin tone. "He was an unhappy man," she remarked. Apart than surviving and speaking for years about the suffering he went through during the Nazi rule, Gert's legacy and fortitude will live on in his family since he got married and had 4 children following the war. Children was a grandfather and great-grandfather who left to transmit a message of peace and healing to next generations. Tears flowed freely for Gert Schramm. We appreciate you viewing. Kindly like and subscribe. Click the bell notification symbol to avoid missing our upcoming episodes. We will see you next time on the channel.